Nestled among the green hills of California's coastline, San Luis Obispo has long been known as a peaceful place where life moves at a gentle pace beneath warm sunshine and streets filled with the energy of youth. Each year, thousands of young people leave their hometowns to begin a new chapter here, carrying plans for the future and the belief that the years ahead will offer countless opportunities. During the Memorial Day weekend of 1996, that town became the center of a mystery that would endure for more than a quarter of a century. Kristen Smart, a 19-year-old woman who had just completed her first year of university, attended a gathering with friends that evening. No one could have imagined that the hours which followed would become the focus of an investigation that law enforcement, the media, and the American public would follow for many years. When daylight broke over the hills surrounding San Luis Obispo, the young woman appeared to have vanished from every familiar trace of her everyday life. The days that followed brought growing concern. Her family waited for a phone call. Her friends hoped there would be a simple explanation for her unusual absence. Instead, the only thing that emerged was a growing number of questions. Every lead that surfaced seemed to open another line of speculation. Every theory raised revealed new gaps that could not be explained. Over time, the case extended far beyond the scope of an ordinary missing person investigation. It became one of the most well-known mysteries in California's history. As the years passed, the search continued. Old case files were reopened. New investigators inherited the work of those who came before them. Yet the answer everyone hoped to find remained out of reach. It would take more than 26 years before a courtroom finally began to reveal what had truly happened on that holiday weekend. And as the curtains slowly lifted, the story behind the case proved to be far more complex than the public had ever imagined. Before we take a closer look at the full case, let us know where you are watching from. If you enjoy real-life investigative stories told in a documentary style, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next case. Before Kristen Smart's name appeared on national news broadcasts and became the focus of one of the most well-known missing person cases in American history, she was simply a young woman excited about the next chapter of her life. To her family, Kristen was a daughter who carried an optimistic outlook and a strong sense of independence. To her friends, she was a friendly, outgoing student who found it easy to connect with those around her. Like many 19-year-olds, Kristen was just beginning to build a future of her own, filled with plans, goals, and dreams that still lay ahead. Kristen Denise Smart was born on 20 February 1977. After graduating from high school, she chose to attend California Polytechnic State University, commonly known as Cal Poly, one of California's most respected public universities. Being accepted into the school was a source of pride for both Kristen and her family. It represented more than an educational opportunity. It was a doorway into the adult life she had long looked forward to. By 1996, Kristen was completing her first year at Cal Poly. She lived in the university residence halls, hundreds of kilometers away from her family. For many students, that stage of life is a mixture of freedom, responsibility, and new experiences. Kristen was no different. She took part in campus activities, met new friends, and gradually adjusted to university life after the uncertainty that often comes with the first months away from home. At the time, San Luis Obispo was a classic California university town. The population was relatively small, the pace of life was calm, and much of the local community revolved around its student population. On weekends, the streets near campus were often filled with groups of friends gathering for meals, conversations, and social events. Many parents felt comfortable sending their children to study there because it had long been regarded as a comparatively safe environment when measured against larger metropolitan areas. By late May 1996, the Cal Poly campus was filled with the relaxed atmosphere of the Memorial Day weekend. After months of classes and exams, students were beginning to look ahead to the approaching summer break. Social gatherings, small parties, and after-hours activities became more frequent. For Kristen, it seemed like just another weekend among many others during her university years. None of the people who knew Kristen could have imagined that those ordinary days were leading towards an event that would change countless lives. Her family believed she was enjoying some of the best years of her youth. Her friends assumed they would see her again in the coming days. The future appeared wide open before her, yet only a few hours later, everything began to move in a completely different direction. What seemed like an ordinary night in that quiet university town became the beginning of a mystery that would endure for more than 26 years, forcing Kristen's family into a search for the truth they had never expected to undertake. On the afternoon of 24 May 1996, the Memorial Day weekend atmosphere had settled across the campus of California Polytechnic State University. After months of classes and exams, Most students were taking the opportunity to unwind with friends before the start of the summer break. Residence halls were busier than usual. Gatherings were taking place throughout the city, and the streets surrounding the university remained active well into the night as students moved between parties and social events. Kristen Smart spent that day much like any other university student. There was nothing to suggest she was in danger. Those who saw her that day remembered a young woman enjoying the holiday weekend with friends after completing her first year at university. No one realized they were witnessing the final hours in which she would be seen in public. As evening turned into night, Kristen attended an off-campus party. Conversations, music, and the energy of the long weekend carried on for hours. According to witness accounts given later, she remained at the gathering until quite late. During the course of the evening, Kristen became increasingly fatigued, making it difficult for her to walk without assistance. Several people at the party noticed that she would need help getting back to her residence hall. Shortly after 2 a.m., on 25 May, the party began to wind down. Kristen left with a small group of students who were making their way back towards campus. Among them were Cheryl Anderson and Tim Davis. Both helped her along sections of the dimly lit route back to the university. It was not a long walk and was one that Cal Poly students traveled regularly. As the group approached the residence halls, people gradually peeled away to return to their own accommodation. Tim Davis was the first to leave. Sometime later, Cheryl Anderson reached her residence building. Before going inside, she saw Kristen continuing on with another student, Paul Flores. According to Cheryl's later recollection, Paul said he would walk Kristen the rest of the way to make sure she got back safely. That was the last confirmed sighting recorded in the entire case. After Cheryl entered her residence hall, Kristen and Paul continued towards the area where they lived. From that point onward, the timeline gives way to a gap that investigators would spend years trying to fill. No independent witness was ever able to confirm exactly what happened next. No one reported seeing Kristen attend classes, return to her room, or appear anywhere else in San Luis Obispo. At the time, her friends had no idea they had just witnessed the last known public sighting of Kristen Smart. To them, it seemed like an entirely ordinary scene at the end of a student party, a young woman making her way home after a night out with friends. But when dawn broke over San Luis Obispo the following morning, a troubling question began to emerge. Kristen had not returned as expected. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than a minor delay. Yet as the hours passed, concern steadily grew, setting in motion a chain of events that would change countless lives in the years to come. The morning of 25 May 1996 began like any other weekend morning in San Luis Obispo. Early sunlight gradually spread across the streets surrounding the Cal Poly campus, while most students continued enjoying the Memorial Day long weekend. For many people, it was simply another ordinary day. Yet somewhere within the city, Kristen Smart's absence was already creating the first signs that something was wrong. Those who knew her were not immediately alarmed. After a night out with friends, it was not unusual for a university student to sleep in or alter their plans for a few hours. As the day wore on, however, people around her began to notice something concerning. Kristen was not showing up at the places she normally frequented. No one had seen her return to her residence hall. Attempts to reach her failed to provide any explanation for her sudden disappearance. Concern continued to grow as the weekend progressed. For the Smart family, the lack of contact had moved well beyond what they considered normal. Kristen was building an independent life at university, but that did not mean she would simply cut off communication with those closest to her. The longer the silence continued, the more unsettling it became. Reports of the missing student soon reached university officials and local law enforcement. A search effort was quickly organized. Friends, students, university staff and volunteers joined in examining areas around the campus. Routes Kristen was known to have traveled were checked. Locations she may have visited were reviewed. Investigators considered every possibility that could help explain where she had gone. Yet the information they gathered only made the situation more puzzling. No one could establish where Kristen had gone after the final hours of the night of 24 May. Her trail appeared to end shortly after she separated from her friends while walking back towards the residence halls. Beyond that point, there was almost nothing. As the first days of the search passed without any positive developments, the case began attracting wider attention throughout the community. What had initially appeared to be an unusual missing student report was steadily becoming a major investigation. Detectives understood that time was critical during the early stages of any missing person case. They therefore focused on reconstructing Kristen's final known movements, hoping to identify the starting point that might eventually lead them to answers. At that stage, no one knew how long the investigation would continue. No one imagined that the file being opened that week would remain on the desks of multiple generations of investigators for more than 2 decades. Yet even in those earliest days, one reality was becoming increasingly clear. This was no longer simply a story about a university student who had lost contact with family and friends. Behind Kristin's disappearance appeared to lie a far larger mystery waiting to be uncovered. As the initial search efforts failed to produce answers, the investigation entered a new phase. Rather than focusing solely on where Kristin Smart might be, detectives turned their attention to a more critical question. What had happened during the final hours before she disappeared? To answer that, they needed to retrace her movements step by step on Memorial Day weekend in 1996. Investigators interviewed numerous students who had attended the party that evening. Statements were compared and cross-checked in an effort to build the most accurate timeline possible. Every conversation, every location Kristin visited, and every person who interacted with her became part of the growing case file. Gradually, a clearer picture of her final known movements began to emerge. Witnesses confirmed that Kristin had spent several hours at an off-campus gathering. By the end of the night, she appeared to be struggling physically and required assistance getting back towards the university accommodation. This detail became particularly significant, as it helped investigators identify the last people known to have been with her before she vanished. Through independent witness accounts, the names Cheryl Anderson and Tim Davis surfaced repeatedly. Both described helping Kristin walk back towards campus. Their recollections were largely consistent and allowed detectives to establish the route the group had taken that night. However, the detail that drew the greatest attention involved the person who remained with Kristin after the others had gradually gone their separate ways. That person was Paul Flores. Paul was also a student at Cal Poly at the time. According to witnesses, as the group approached the residence halls, individuals began peeling away to return to their own accommodation. After Cheryl Anderson left the group, Kristin was reportedly last seen continuing on with Paul. It was the final confirmed sighting of her by any independent witness. That discovery immediately placed Paul at the center of the investigation. Detectives interviewed him and sought an explanation for what had occurred after he and Kristin parted from the others. Although Paul maintained that he had no involvement in her disappearance, aspects of his account raised further questions that investigators felt required closer examination. As information continued to be gathered, detectives also received reports concerning Paul's behavior both before and after Kristin went missing. Some witnesses described conduct they considered unusual or concerning. While these observations were not enough to draw definitive conclusions, they were sufficient to keep him firmly within the focus of the inquiry. At the same time, law enforcement carried out extensive searches of locations connected to Kristin's final known movements. Student accommodation, walking routes, and surrounding areas were examined in detail. Every lead, no matter how small, was documented in the hope that it might point investigators towards the truth. Yet the deeper detectives dug, the more they encountered a frustrating reality. They had identified the last known person seen with Kristin Smart, but they still lacked a clear explanation for what happened afterwards. The investigation increasingly resembled a puzzle with its most important piece missing. And it was that missing piece that would continue to haunt the case for many years to come. The first few weeks after Kristin Smart disappeared were marked by extensive search efforts and a constant flow of new information. However, as the summer of 1996 wore on, the investigation began to face a challenge familiar to many complex missing person cases: time. With each passing day, the prospect of finding answers became increasingly difficult. While Kristin's family endured the uncertainty of waiting without knowing when, or if, that wait would ever end. For Stan and Denise Smart, Kristin's parents, life was effectively divided into two distinct chapters. One was the period before their daughter vanished. The other was the ongoing journey to uncover the truth behind the question that had first emerged in May 1996. They attended meetings with investigators, followed every new development, and worked tirelessly to ensure the case was not forgotten as public attention gradually shifted elsewhere. Across the San Luis Obispo community, Kristin Smart's name continued to be remembered. Many of the students who had attended Cal Poly at the time graduated and moved on, yet memories of the mysterious disappearance remained. Each year brought a new intake of students to campus, while Kristin's case stayed on the list of California's unsolved investigations. Detectives never completely set the matter aside either. Although a decisive breakthrough remained elusive, fresh leads were examined whenever they surfaced. Some prompted additional inquiries, while others were carefully assessed and later ruled out after being compared against the evidence already on file. The process continued quietly for years, rarely making headlines but never truly coming to a halt. In 2002, 6 years after Kristin disappeared, a court officially declared her legally deceased. The ruling did not bring the investigation to an end, but it reflected a painful reality her family had been forced to confront. Even so, the absence of answers continued to set the case apart from most others. They knew their daughter was not coming home, Yet they still did not know exactly what had happened or who was responsible. For many years afterwards, the Kristen Smart case remained an unresolved gap within California's justice system. Generations of investigators inherited the file before eventually passing it on to those who followed. Documents were preserved, key witness statements remained on record, and the evidence that had already been gathered was carefully maintained in the hope that advances in science, or perhaps a new piece of information, might one day provide a different path forward. By the late 2010s, the case had entered its third decade. That span of time was long enough to change an entire generation. Yet for the Smart family, the clock seemed permanently fixed on Memorial Day weekend in 1996. Then, after years of little meaningful progress, a series of new developments began to emerge, creating the opportunity investigators had been waiting for more than 2 decades. As the investigation into Kristen Smart's disappearance entered the final years of the 2010s, signs of renewed momentum began to emerge after a long period of relative stagnation. This was no longer a phase centered on large-scale searches or extensive witness interviews like those conducted in the early years. Instead, investigators shifted their focus towards modern investigative tools while re-examining the entire case through a fresh lens, taking advantage of forensic advances that had not existed when the original detectives first opened the file. Over more than 2 decades, thousands of pages of material had accumulated. Every witness statement, field report, and interview had been preserved. As data analysis technology and investigative techniques continued to evolve, information that had once seemed fully explored was reviewed once again. Individual details that had appeared insignificant in isolation were now being assessed alongside one another in the hope of uncovering previously unseen connections. At the same time, public interest in the case began to grow once more. In-depth articles, investigative programs, and, in particular, media projects focused on Kristen Smart's disappearance brought the story back into the spotlight. Many who remembered the case from the 1990s started following new developments, while an entirely different generation was introduced for the first time to the mystery that had lingered over Cal Poly for so many years. A significant turning point arrived in 2019 with the release of the investigative podcast Your Own Backyard. The series quickly attracted national attention for its detailed approach and its comprehensive examination of information connected to the case. While public interest could never replace the work of law enforcement, it helped generate renewed momentum and encouraged continued scrutiny of the investigation. Meanwhile, detectives began undertaking activities that would have been far less effective years earlier. Locations that had featured in the case file were re-examined using modern methods and technology. Certain properties connected to individuals who had long been of investigative interest were also added to a list of locations for further review. The goal was not necessarily to develop an entirely new theory, but to determine whether long-standing leads might reveal something more when viewed through the capabilities and experience of a new era. Gradually, those efforts began producing results. Several new findings attracted particular attention from investigators. They were not enough to solve the case outright, but they provided a foundation for the next critical step. After years of existing as an unresolved mystery, Kristen Smart's case began showing signs that it was finally moving closer to the truth. And it was from this point onward that the investigation took a dramatically different direction. What emerged from the renewed reviews helped authorities narrow their focus, paving the way for a series of developments that would ultimately reshape the entire case in the years that followed. The renewed momentum that emerged in the late 2010s provided a significant boost to an investigation that had already stretched across more than 2 decades. After years spent gathering information, reviewing evidence, and comparing witness accounts, investigators began concentrating their resources on a far more specific direction, rather than continuing to cast a wide net. The case was no longer simply being maintained. It had entered a phase focused on actively pursuing answers. From 2020 onwards, law enforcement agencies in California carried out a series of new investigative operations connected to locations that had repeatedly surfaced throughout the case file. Forensic teams were deployed to several sites to examine indicators that modern technology was far better equipped to detect than it had been years earlier. The searches attracted considerable media attention because, for the first time in a long while, the case appeared to be making clear and sustained progress. Throughout this process, investigators devoted particular attention to properties associated with the Flores family. Locations that had featured in earlier reports were revisited using more advanced and comprehensive methods. Any findings were carefully compared against the evidence accumulated over decades to determine whether they aligned with the established timeline of the case. At the same time, detectives continued compiling witness information from a variety of sources. Some individuals who had previously spoken with investigators were contacted again, while others came forward with information for the first time. Although no single detail was necessarily enough to transform the investigation on its own, together they began forming a far more complete picture of what may have occurred after Kristen Smart disappeared. As investigators delved deeper into the file, the focus of the case became increasingly narrow. Theories that had circulated for years were gradually ruled out when they failed to match the emerging evidence. Instead, more and more elements pointed investigators towards the same individual. Significantly, this was someone who had been part of the investigation from the very beginning and had been interviewed numerous times over the previous 2 decades. By early 2021, prosecutors and investigators believed they had accumulated sufficient evidence to move the case into an entirely new phase. After years spent pursuing leads, evaluating reports and reviewing witness statements, the gap between suspicion and legal action had begun to shrink considerably. The next steps would no longer be limited to investigative work. They would involve presenting everything that had been gathered before the justice system. For the Smart family, this period carried deeply mixed emotions. On one hand, they understood that the case was moving closer than ever to the answers they had waited so many years to receive. On the other, every new development brought back memories of a loss that had never truly healed. Nevertheless, more than 26 years after Memorial Day weekend in 1996, the investigation had finally reached the threshold of the most significant turning point in its entire history, PHN 9. After more than 26 years, as one of California's most well-known unsolved cases, the Kristen Smart investigation finally reached a pivotal moment. What detectives had accumulated through years of reviewing evidence, comparing witness statements and conducting forensic examinations, led them to a conclusion they believed could explain the mysterious disappearance of the first-year university student in the spring of 1996. On 13 April 2021, law enforcement officers carried out a series of coordinated operations across multiple locations. That day, Paul Flores was arrested in connection with Kristen Smart's death. It was a development Kristen's family had been waiting more than a quarter of a century to see. From the earliest stages of the investigation, Paul's name had remained part of the case because he was the last person confirmed to have been with Kristen before she vanished. At the same time, Ruben Flores, Paul's father, was also arrested in a separate matter involving allegations that he had helped conceal evidence after the events of 1996. The decision to take legal action against both father and son immediately attracted attention across the United States. After years of watching the case expand, stall, and then fall quiet once again, the public was finally witnessing a concrete step towards establishing criminal responsibility. News of the arrest spread rapidly throughout California. For many who had followed the case since the 1990s, it represented the most significant development since the day Kristen disappeared. For the Smart family, the moment brought a mixture of relief and renewed heartache after decades of waiting. They understood that an arrest did not mean the case was over, but it marked a step forward that for many years had seemed almost impossible to achieve. In the days that followed, prosecutors began outlining the basis for the charges that had been filed. A case that had spanned multiple generations of investigators was now entering an entirely different stage. The focus was no longer on determining what had happened to Kristen Smart, but on preparing for a judicial process in which the evidence gathered over decades would be examined in court. After years of existing as an unanswered mystery, the story had finally moved closer to the point where the justice system would evaluate everything investigators had uncovered. From this moment onward, the case entered the final chapter of a pursuit of justice that had lasted more than 26 years. Following the arrests in 2021, the Kristen Smart case officially entered the trial phase, marking the first time in more than 26 years that allegations connected to the disappearance of the Cal Poly student were presented before a court. Given the intense public interest surrounding the case and its impact on the San Luis Obispo community, the trial was moved to Monterey County to help ensure an impartial jury selection process. Throughout the proceedings, which extended over several months, prosecutors presented the timeline of events, witness testimony, investigative findings gathered over decades, and forensic evidence they argued was linked to Kristen's disappearance. The defense challenged those claims, maintaining that no direct evidence existed to prove the allegations beyond doubt. Both sides laid out their arguments before the jury, making the case one of the most closely watched criminal trials in California during 2022. In October 2022, after deliberations were completed, the jury returned its verdict regarding Paul Flores. He was found guilty of first-degree murder in connection with Kristen Smart's death. Ruben Flores, meanwhile, was acquitted of the charges brought against him. The outcome brought months of courtroom proceedings to a close and marked the first time the justice system had formally established criminal responsibility in a case that had remained unresolved for more than 2 decades. In March 2023, Paul Flores was sentenced to 25 years to life in a California state prison. For the Smart family, the sentence could not bring Kristen back, nor could it answer every question that still surrounded the case. However, after years of pursuing justice, they finally received a verdict they had been waiting for since the spring of 1996. Even so, one important fact remains unchanged. Kristen Smart's final resting place has never been located. As a result, despite the conclusion of the trial, her family and investigators continue to hope that one day the remaining pieces of the story will be uncovered, allowing a journey that has spanned so many years to reach a true conclusion. Nearly 3 decades have passed since Kristen Smart disappeared from the Cal Poly campus, yet the impact of the case continues to be felt by her family, friends, and the wider San Luis Obispo community. A young university student with her whole future ahead of her never had the opportunity to fulfill the plans and ambitions she carried into adulthood. For many years, Kristen's loved ones lived with the void created by her absence, while continuing their determined search for answers to a question that had haunted them since the spring of 1996. The court's verdict marked a significant milestone in the pursuit of justice, but the story has not been fully brought to a close. To this day, Kristen's final resting place remains unknown, leaving her family holding on to the hope that one day they may find a greater sense of peace. Even so, their persistence over the years played a crucial role in keeping attention focused on the case and ultimately helped bring it before the justice system. The case also serves as a reminder of the importance of perseverance in criminal investigations. Some files appear destined to remain buried beneath the passage of time, yet through the dedication of successive generations of detectives, prosecutors, and people unwilling to abandon hope, the truth can still emerge. Even if it takes decades to uncover, Kristen Smart's story is remembered as more than just one of California's most significant criminal cases. It is the story of a family determined to find answers, a community unwilling to forget, and countless individuals who spent years pursuing justice to its conclusion. For that reason, even as time continues to move forward, Kristen Smart's name will remain an enduring part of the history surrounding this case. If you enjoy true crime cases presented in a documentary-style format, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss future stories.